The Albigensian Wars were not a sudden outburst of fanaticism. They were the result of decades of tension between the Roman Church and southern France, a region that lived differently and had no intention of apologizing for it. By the end of the 12th century, Languedoc was one of the wealthiest and most culturally developed regions of Europe. Its cities enjoyed a high degree of self-government. The nobility was tied less to the French crown than to its own dynastic interests, and royal authority was weak. Local aristocrats patronized troubadour poets, supported trade, and were reluctant to submit either to Paris, which hindered the centralization of France, or to Rome. It was precisely in this society that Cathar teaching found particularly fertile ground. The Cathars did not regard themselves as heretics. They believed they were true Christians returning to apostolic purity. Their worldview was based on a strict dualism. The spiritual world belonged to God, while the material world was the domain of evil. From this followed a rejection of wealth, luxury, and ecclesiastical hierarchy. They did not recognize the Pope, had no need for churches, and did not accept the sacraments in the Catholic sense. Their religious leaders, the so-called perfects, lived ascetically, traveled constantly, preached, and cared for the sick. Against the background of corrupt and often openly venal Catholic clergy, they appeared as a moral ideal. The Roman Church clearly understood the danger. This was not merely a theological dispute. The Cathars undermined the very foundations of ecclesiastical authority. If salvation did not require the Pope, tithes, or sacraments, then the entire structure of medieval society was threatened. For this reason, Pope Innocent III, who ascended the papal throne in 1198, initially attempted to act cautiously. Preachers were sent to Languedoc, debates were organized, and efforts were made to persuade local lords to suppress the heresy on their own. Among these preachers was Dominic de Guzman, the future Saint Dominic. However, all such efforts met with indifference or open resistance from the local nobility. Many major feudal lords, including Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, not only refused to combat the Cathars but actively protected them. Gradually, the Pope resorted to harsher measures. Disloyal bishops were removed, papal legates were appointed, and pressure increased. In 1207, Raymond VI was excommunicated. The decisive moment came in January 1208 with the murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau. Although there was no direct evidence of Raymond's guilt, in Rome the crime was perceived as an attack on papal authority. Innocent III responded decisively by proclaiming a crusade against Languedoc, promising participants absolution of sins and the lands of heretics. Thus began a war without precedent. This crusade was directed not against Muslims or pagans, but against Christians living within a Christian kingdom. In the summer of 1209, a massive army of northern French knights gathered in Lyon, driven by both religious zeal and the desire for profit. Their first target was Béziers. The city refused to surrender the Cathars, and after the assault it was completely destroyed. The massacre was total. People were killed indiscriminately, and churches offered no refuge. Contemporary observers spoke of thousands of victims, and even if the numbers were exaggerated, the scale of violence was shocking. Béziers became a symbol of what awaited Languedoc. After Béziers, it became clear that the crusade would not be limited to intimidation. It was turning into a systematic conquest. The next target was Carcassonne, a powerful fortress and one of the key centers of Languedoc, ruled by Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel. Unlike Béziers, here the Crusaders avoided brute force and relied on calculation. They approached the city in August 1209 and quickly realized that a direct assault would be costly. Instead, they cut off the water supply. The besieged city, overcrowded with refugees, was doomed. Raymond Roger rode out to negotiate with the Crusaders and was arrested. A few days later, Carcassonne capitulated. There was no mass slaughter, but the inhabitants were expelled from the city, allowed to leave with nothing but the clothes they wore. The Viscount himself died in captivity, apparently of illness, although many in Languedoc long believed he had been poisoned. It was after the fall of Carcassonne that the crusade found its true master. Simon de Montfort, a northern French baron, harsh and fanatically convinced of his righteousness, was appointed military leader. From that moment on, the war acquired a systematic character. Montfort did not merely destroy cities, he redistributed lands, transforming a religious campaign into a vast redistribution of property. The estates of Cathar supporters were confiscated and granted to crusaders. Faith and material interests thus became inseparably intertwined. In 1210 to 1211, Montfort's army methodically crushed resistance. The siege of Minerve was particularly revealing. The city held out for a long time, but eventually capitulated after its walls were destroyed. The Cathars were offered a choice: abjuration or death. Most inhabitants formally accepted Catholicism, but 140 perfects refused. They were led outside the city and burned alive on a massive pyre. This was not a spontaneous act of fury, but a carefully planned demonstration of terror. Lavore, which fell in 1211, became an even darker symbol. Its lady, Dame Giraud, was thrown into a well and stoned, while several hundred defenders were executed. Nevertheless, Languedoc was not a passive victim. Resistance persisted, and the Cathars and their supporters began to hope for external assistance. In 1213, King Peter II of Aragon intervened in the conflict. As overlord of part of southern France, he clearly understood that a crusader victory would strengthen France. His forces met Montfort's army at Muret. The battle proved to be a turning point. Despite numerical superiority, the southern coalition suffered a crushing defeat, and Peter II himself was killed. This was not only a military but also a psychological blow. Languedoc was left alone. After Muret, Montfort's position was greatly strengthened. Raymond VI was forced into exile, Toulouse fell under Crusader control, and in 1215 the Fourth Lateran Council officially recognized Simon de Montfort as the legitimate ruler of the conquered territories. It seemed that the war was nearing its end, yet it was precisely at this moment that the situation changed once again. The brutality of the occupiers, along with confiscations and executions, provoked widespread resentment. Cities rose in revolt, and former vassals of Montfort defected to the southern cause. In 1217, Raymond VI and his son returned and were welcomed in Toulouse as liberators. Simon de Montfort began a siege of the city, but on 25th of June 1218 he was killed when a stone launched from a city siege engine struck him in the head. His death was deeply symbolic. The man who embodied Crusader terror fell at the hands of townspeople. After Montfort's death, the war entered a new phase. His son Amaury proved incapable of retaining the conquered lands. The southern forces gradually reclaimed cities, and the conflict increasingly resembled a prolonged civil war. However, the decisive factor had not yet intervened: the French crown. In 1226, King Louis VIII personally led a new campaign into Languedoc. This was no longer a papal initiative but a state conquest. Cities and castles surrendered with little resistance. 20 years of warfare had exhausted the region. Even after Louis's death, the advance continued under the leadership of the regent, Blanche of Castile. In 1229, Raymond VII signed the Treaty of Paris, Meaux, effectively acknowledging defeat. Languedoc lost its political autonomy and passed under the control of the French crown. The end of military hostilities did not mean the end of the Cathars. Their eradication was entrusted to the Inquisition. From the 1230s onward, the Dominicans launched a systematic hunt for heresy. Interrogations, denunciations, confiscations of property, and executions by fire became part of everyday life in the region. The last major Cathar stronghold was the Castle of Montségur. It held out for 9 months and fell in 1244. More than 200 Cathars refused to recant and were burned alive. This was no longer a war but a ritualized extermination. By the middle of the 13th century, Catharism as an organized movement had ceased to exist. Its last adherents went into hiding for several decades, but the outcome was inevitable. The Albigensian Wars ended in the complete victory of church and crown, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives and the destruction of the unique culture of southern France. According to various estimates, around 1 million people perished, including victims on both sides. This was the first instance in European history of total violence justified by religion and implemented with full state systematization,